Hello and welcome back to the OTB channel. Something a little bit different today. I'm going to look at a virtualization product that's been around for a long time. When I first got into virtualization, it was when I was working in the IT industry, and we used to do a lot of testing of servers, and we used a product called VMware Workstation at the time. And it worked pretty well. Over the years that I was working in that industry, however, VirtualBox started to rear its head and took over. I think one of the main reasons was it was a free product, whereas VMware Workstation wasn't. And I haven't really looked at VMware for years and years. But I noticed the other day that they now do a product called VMware Workstation Player, which is free for non-commercial use. Now, it's a proprietary package, so let's make no bones about that. There's nothing open source about this package. But if you're a pragmatist and you're not overly bothered about only using open source products, it may be something to consider. Those people who wouldn't touch proprietary software will not want to know about this. And that's fair enough. It's completely up to yourself. But I thought, well, it's free. Let's give it a spin and let's see how it stacks up against VirtualBox and do a little bit of a comparison. Not exactly a scientific comparison, but a comparison based on how I use the product. Now, I should say before we start that this is based on how I would use a virtualization product as a desktop user, not as a commercial organization. And in that respect, I would use it for, well, as an alternative, say for dual booting. I could run a Windows virtual machine. That's always a good route. Just to have a look at a new distro, or to do a bit of a review. That's a second use. And a third use is educational. I installed Gentoo the first time on VirtualBox. And if you're installing Arch for the first time, you may use it as for that reason. So virtualization products, just for the desktop user, can be incredibly useful. Beyond that, there's all sorts of uses that the IT industry use it for, but I'm not going to touch on them. This is simply based on how useful would it be for a desktop user. So let's get into it. So let's start by having a look at a tool that I've used extensively for this channel, VirtualBox. And you should see the interface in front of you now on the screen. It's completely open source. It's available in the vast majority of distro repositories. Interestingly enough, it's not actually available in the latest Debian stable repo, but it's easy enough to add by adding the Oracle repo. It's open source. It has a set of guest editions, read drivers, if you like, that you can install from within the virtual machine, or in some cases direct from the repository. And you can also install an extension pack, which enables such things as USB 3. You can see on this one the Debian installation virtual machine. I actually installed that last week to go through the little tweaks I was making. But if I wanted to create a new virtual machine, it takes literally seconds. I would simply hit new on the interface, type a name. Let's stick with, I don't know, let's do Debian again, but I'll call it Debian 2. It's already picked Debian 64-bit as the version, and it has a long list of different distros that you can select there, and if in doubt you can always select other Linux 64-bit. But let's stick with Debian. I click next, I set the memory. I've got 16 gig of RAM on this machine, on this computer, so I tend to use half of that for a virtual machine. Oh, nearly there. So 8,192 megs. I click next. I ask it to create a virtual hard disk now. I always get given the option, what kind of hard disk do you want to create? I just stick with the default, which is the VirtualBox disk image, but you can actually create other forms, including a VMDK file, which I believe is the VMware default. I click next. I always select a dynamically allocated virtual disk. This means that it won't immediately fill up your hard drive with its full size. It will put a full size aside, for instance 30 gig, but it will only show 30 gig on your hard drive when it is actually filled up to its maximum size. It then asks me how large I want to make that hard drive, so let's click 32 gig just as an example, and I create it. So that's the basic virtual machine created. I then go into settings and apply a few tweaks. If you want drag and drop support from your host machine through to the guest machine, you can share the clipboard here. You can have it host to guest, guest to host, or bidirectional. I move down to the system. I always disable the floppy. Pointing device is always set to USB tablet for some reason. By default, I tend to leave it at that, to be honest. And if I wanted to select EFI, this is where I click the button. I don't know why it's still an experimental feature, given that most modern hardware these days is EFI. It can be a bit buggy, VirtualBox's implementation of EFI, as you know, but it does seem to be getting better. I then move on to the processor tab. It says I've got 4 CPUs. I've actually got a dual CPU i5, but it's counting the number of threads, so I'm going to give it 2 threads. Acceleration, well, I always enable VT-X, which means that it can access the hardware capabilities of my computer. You will need to access this setting in your BIOS or EFI firmware so that it can do that, but it's generally faster and more efficient. I then go down to the display. I don't tend to change the video memory of the display, but I do enable 3D acceleration, and for the last half dozen times or so, I've been selecting the latest VBox SVGA as the virtual graphics controller, as I found it to be quite stable. I then move down to storage. You'll see that my Debian 2 virtual hard drive is there, but I want to hook it up to an ISO file. So I click the empty IDE controller, and I've already got the Debian Live Mate non-free ISO in my downloads folder. I've been playing with this a little bit, so it's picked it up straight away. Audio, I tend to disable that because when recording a video, I found that if I enable the audio on a virtual machine, it distorts the sound coming from my microphone. But what you do is completely up to yourself. As far as network is concerned, I always choose the bridged adapter. That makes the virtual machine just look like a normal computer on your network, rather than creating a private network inside your network. Serial ports, I don't bother enabling them. USB, well, it defaults to USB 2. I could select USB 3, but I'm not going to be using the USB ports, so I'm not that bothered. Shared folders. If I want to create a shared folder that the virtual machine can read directly from on my host machine, I would set it up in here. It works pretty straightforwardly, not really a problem. And the user interface, I just leave that as is and click OK. If I want to start a machine, I then simply hit the start button. And although it tends to start on my other screen, it then gives me this screen as it's starting to boot in EFI mode. And it goes through its normal process until we get to the desktop. The virtual machine then just acts like any other operating system that I would be installing on a hard drive. So that's pretty much it. It's simple, it's free. I found it to be pretty reliable. Yes, it does get the odd bug. The areas where I've suffered the most bugs is certainly in terms of the UEFI implementation, but that does seem to be getting better. There we go, it's actually booted. I've also found that the shared folder facility and the copy and paste facility between host and guest can be a little bit buggy at times, but generally speaking, it does what I want. So how different is VMware from this? Well, let's have a look. So, VMware Workstation Player, bit of a mouthful, because there used to be a VMware Player and there used to be a VMware Workstation, and there is still a VMware Workstation Pro. But you're looking for VM Workstation 15 Player, although it's actually 15.5 now. You'll need to go to the VMware website where you can download it. Unfortunately, you don't download it as a deb file or an RPM file. It just comes as a script, essentially, a bundle file. So by all means, download it, Workstation 15.5 Player for Linux. And what I then did was I went straight away to the Debian wiki to see what extra packages I might need to install. It's a little bit out of date, to say the least. The wiki for Debian, it talks about installing VMware Player 4 and VMware Workstation 8. But I thought, well, the dependencies won't have changed that much. And so I went to the section that says running VMware on AMD 64, and I followed this line, which installs basically a number of lib files, build essential, the Linux headers. I also installed GCC, and I then proceeded to run the package. And I found the most useful web page for this is actually the Arch wiki. If you run Arch, you can actually install it direct from the AUR, should I say, as there are various packages that are there for that purpose. And in fact, the Arch wiki recommends that you do install the AUR packages as opposed to the bundle package. However, if you decide to install the bundle, which you have to do in Debian, the Arch wiki gives you the dependencies which need to be installed, and it then gives you a nice straightforward command. You need to be root or sudo. You just issue sh and you run the bundle. I found that this was a text installation initially, and as the Arch wiki does state here, during the installation I did get an error saying there was no rc.d style init script directories. And And of course, Debian is systemd now, as is Arch. But as Arch said I could safely ignore it, I just carried on as normal and accepted all the defaults. Once the defaults had been accepted, VMware had been installed on my system, I then proceeded to have a play. It's probably important to mention at this point that VM Workstation Player is free to download and use for non-commercial use. If you want to use it for commercial purposes, I think it's £131.95, so convert that into euros or US dollars as you see fit, and that gives you the option to use it in a business environment. Because of that, I would be very, very wary about using this to demo distros on YouTube, especially if I had a monetized channel. And it would really have to be worth it for me to spend over 130 quid on a virtualization package. But if you're just using it for personal use, there's no problem. So you can see the interface in front of you. It's got a nice clean interface. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through exactly the same process as I did in VirtualBox, and I'm going to show you how to install a Debian stable virtual machine. So I'm just going to click on the Create a New Virtual Machine button and see where it takes us. It asks us if where we want to install the operating system from. You'll see that Use ISO Image is already highlighted there, and it's already hooked up to the Debian non-free Mate ISO. So great. I click Next. Which operating system will be installed? Well, obviously Linux, and it asks me to choose the version. There's a few distros on here, but they're mainly the enterprise one. So SUSE, Linux Enterprise, etc., etc. And you may think that there isn't actually anything to do with Debian here. But actually, if you scroll up, there is an entry for Debian 10 64-bit. So all good. We click Next. Virtual machine name, Debian 10 64-bit. I'm just going to keep that as default and click Next. What do I want the disk size to be? Well, 20 gig, which it seems to be telling me at the moment is recommended. We'll leave it there. What do I want to do as far as the virtual disk is concerned? Do I want to make it as a single file or split it into multiple files? Let's just keep it as a single file. I'm not really sure what the benefits of splitting it into multiple files would be. It says it makes it easier to move to another computer, but may reduce performance with very large disks. Hey, let's just use a single file. We'll click Next. Click Finish to create the virtual machine. So, what it's given it by default is 2 gigs of memory. The network adapter is set up to NAT rather than bridged, and it has other devices such as a virtual CD, DVD drive, USB controller, etc., etc. I don't want to automatically power it on at this stage, so I'm going to uncheck the tick box and click Finish. Right. Virtual machine created successfully. You still need to install the operating system and VMware tools. I do indeed. So let's just close that. We now have an entry, Debian 10, and a very, very basic interface where we can either power it on or edit the virtual machine settings. So let's open up the virtual machine settings. I think it's only fair to do a comparison with VirtualBox. So the first area here is memory. I'm going to drag it to 8 gigs. Processors. Currently the number of processor cores is set to 1. It isn't telling me how many cores I've actually got. I certainly haven't got 16 cores, and that's an option on this. But I'm going to choose 2 on the assumption that it's actually referring to threads. It's asking me to set the virtualization engine. It hasn't automatically selected Intel VT-X. So I'm going to click on that just to try and make sure the performance is good. Okay, the hard disk file doesn't tell me a huge amount here. CD-ROM, connector, power on, okay. Network adapter, there we've got an option there to make it a bridged adapter. And we've even got an advanced button. Right, okay. I'm going to close that because it looks beyond me without doing a little bit of research to start off with. Our sound card, I want to disable that. Printer, I'm just going to disable that for the time being. USB controller, USB 2. Well, that's what I set in VirtualBox, so we'll just keep it as that. And the display. Do I want to accelerate 3D graphics? Well, that's what I selected in VirtualBox, so let me click on that. It says I must update tools to enable 3D acceleration in this virtual machine. Okay, what I would say is that VMware Tools is the same as VirtualBox Guest Editions, so we will need to install them, so that's fine. Now, going back to this interface, after the Hardware tab, we have a second tab, which is our options. So it's telling us the name of the virtual machine, it's Linux, it's Debian, and it's telling me where suspend and snapshot files will be stored. Power, okay. Enter full screen mode after powering on, that could be useful. Shared folders, fine, that's not a problem. VMware Tools, time sync off. I've no idea what that means, but it looks like there's an auto update to that if necessary. VNC connections, okay, and auto login not supported. Let's just click save. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do on this was to set Debian up to boot in UEFI mode. I've had a look through the settings and I can't see any way to actually do this from the menu. However, after reading around, I have found a way to enable it. So I can confirm that if you don't enable EFI, it will just boot in standard BIOS mode, which wasn't what I wanted. But after reading and doing some research, let me just open a terminal here and make this a little bit bigger. Apparently you can manually edit the virtual machine file. So you see my home directory there. I'm just going to CD into the VMware directory that has been created and do an ls. Okay, I'm now going to CD into Debian and do another ls. And you can see there that there are a number of files. There is a VMSD file, a VMDK file, a VMXF file, and a .vmx file. We need to edit the .vmx file. And we do this just with Nano. So if I open this with Nano, I don't need to be root to do this because it's in my home directory. And I just select the VMX file. You'll see that I come out with what is basically a configuration file. And in this configuration file, I add the entry firmware equals EFI in double brackets. I'll save that. and I should now be good to go. So let's click power on and see what happens. The following devices can be connected to this virtual machine. Okay, I'm just going to click OK. It booted pretty quick there to the grub screen. So we'll boot and see what happens. I should say that I've done this a couple of times now over the course of the week, just to see what it's like. And my general feeling is that the UEFI support in VMware feels a lot more solid than it does in VirtualBox. It's just a feeling. It's nothing I can quantify, but it does seem like it doesn't struggle quite so much. But as you can see, it's booting now. We're still getting this black screen, which seems to be something to do with EFI mode, but hopefully we shall in a second boot straight into the Debian live DVD ISO image, and we can kind of go on from there. And there we go. I'm not expecting to get full resolution on this at the moment, simply because we haven't got the VMware tools installed. But if I try and make this full screen, let's see how far it goes. Nowhere at all. So let's open up, let's open up Control Center, Displays, and see if we can actually make it a bit bigger, just to make it usable. 1920 by 1080 isn't there, so let me just click the default 1680 by 1050, which seems to work across the board. This is enough to get started. I'll double click the Debian installer. What I'm really looking for here as we go along is whether or not it has set it up in UEFI mode, and the Debian installer should tell us this as we go along. So let me just set up British English, our time zone, London, our keyboard. Aha, this is what I'm waiting for. The boot environment of this system. Right, it's set up as EFI. So that little entry we made in the configuration file appears to have worked. Now, you've all seen this Debian installation before, so I'm not going to take you through this. We'll come back in a second when it's installed. Right, so we're back. I completed the installation and it was flawless. I rebooted. I've set the resolution back to 1680 by 1050. And the next stage that I need to do is I need to install VMware tools. Now, we can do this in a number of ways. The easy way for any distro is simply to access it from the menu, select Install VMware Tools. It will mount an ISO file and you can install it from there. In Debian, it's even easier because we actually have the VMware Tools package, or Open VMware Tools, in our package repos. So let me just open Synaptic. I can't remember the exact name, but it starts with Open. Okay, it's not taken us all the way there, but let's go to Open. Open. Scroll down until we find it, and there it is, Open VM Tools. I'm going to mark that for installation, hit apply, and this should give us better graphics, so we should be able to go back into full screen and do everything that we need to do. We've already seen some changes there as we've installed it, but let me actually reboot this now and see where we get to. So after installing the Open VMware Tools package from the Debian repos, I simply rebooted. It was in full screen mode, and as soon as I got past the login screen, Light DM, it opened up in full HD resolution. Just to show you this, it's now at 1920 by 1080 automatically. So a fairly simple process, to be honest. We have a menu at the top, which allows us access to various bits and pieces. We can get rid of that menu or bring it back and keep it there all together. I'm just going to hide it for the time being. And here we have our Mate desktop in full screen mode, and it's seamless. I have tried playing with shared folders. It works. I have tried playing with copy and paste between host and guest. It works. If anything, it seems to be running slightly faster than it does in VirtualBox. And other than that, it's doing exactly what I need it to do. So I suppose the question now is, do you use VMware or do you use VirtualBox? Well, let's have a chat. So, that's VMware Workstation Player. So, before I start, I said that copy and paste was seamless, and I forgot one particular issue. When I installed the VMware or the Open VMware Tools package in Debian, I initially couldn't get the drag and drop and the copy and paste between host and guest to work. But again, a little bit of research. What I needed to install was the Open VM Tools .desktop package from the repositories. And once that was installed, there was no problem. What doesn't it do? It's a proprietary system, and VMware have many different versions of their virtualization products, mostly for commercial use. So what are the restrictions? Well, I've just opened up a web page here, VMware Arena. Okay. And it gives us a list here of what it can't do. It doesn't have a draggable tabbed interface. Okay. It can't run multiple VMs at one time. So you can only launch one VM at a time. And to be honest, that's all my system could cope with, so that's not an issue. Create and manage encrypted VMs, you can't do that. You can't take snapshots, which you can, of course, do in VirtualBox. How much of a problem that is for you will depend on what you use the virtual operating system for. You can't do advanced networking, whatever that means. You can't create a linked clone, share a virtual machine as a server, connect to vCloud Air, or have the command line operation. Okay. If I'm honest, none of those are things that I would tend to use. So do you use VMware or do you use VirtualBox when you're a desktop user? Well, I think it comes down to personal preference, really. Both are great products. It's a proprietary product, VMware, so if you'd prefer to use open source, use open source. And I would generally support that decision because it's only by supporting open source products that they will continue to exist. And personally, I'm going to continue to support VirtualBox. However, and there's always a however, I was quite impressed. It did feel very solid, more or less solid than VirtualBox. I couldn't really say. Both are pretty good these days. The EFI implementation seemed to be quite solid. I rebooted this machine multiple times and I didn't have any issues. I couldn't say the same about VirtualBox. There's a few things it doesn't do, VMware, and if I'm honest, the things it doesn't do are the things I'm not likely to use, so it wouldn't be a big issue. There were a few things, though, that I didn't like. I didn't like the fact that it's not packaged in one of the standard Linux packaging formats, which makes upgrade and uninstallation or deinstallation, whatever you want to call it, not quite as straightforward. I'd like to see it as a standard deb file for Debian. You haven't got that problem if you're using Arch, because you can install it as an AUR package. I was also a little bit put out when I got the error message about the RCD directories. So it clearly doesn't really support systemd natively. It wasn't a big issue because it still worked. However, whatever you think of systemd, that's the way the Linux desktop seems to be going. So I think really it should support that. I didn't like the way that I had to edit a text file to get it to support an EFI installation. As simple as that was and as solid as it was once I got it up and running. But these are niggles, really. It's going to come down to you. What do you want to use? VMware and VirtualBox are both solid products. They both do the job. It's a matter of personal preference and it's a matter of choice. And that's what Linux is all about. So that's all I want to talk about today. Hope you have a great weekend, everyone. And I will see you next week with a slight difference to the video. I've finally forked out and I've bought myself an Alpha 5100 Sony mirrorless camera. So I'm going to be trying to set that up to replace the webcam over the next week. But until then, have a great weekend.